Lecture number 15, Forerunners of Luther, Lyra, Valla, Erasmus, and Akhom. 1. One does not always think of these men who never broke with the church, not to mention paying with their lives for so doing, as forerunners of the reformers, Lyra, Valla, Erasmus, and Akhom. But some reformers do live and die in peace, while their disciples die for their principles. We know that very well. You see that people frequently who write books are recluses, spend their lives in libraries, learn a great deal, and yet don't do a great deal themselves, but have an immense influence on people who read their books. In a certain sense, Karl Marx is an illustration of that. He's the father of the communist revolution, but he spent most of his time writing about it, and while he promoted it in a measure, he nevertheless didn't begin to accomplish what his disciples did later on. We consider that a bad illustration of this truth. There are such things as good illustrations too, and the people we're dealing with now are people who were not nearly so prominent on the scene as Luther, who nevertheless, in a sense, created Luther by their own writings, had a benign influence on Luther more than any that they actually exercised themselves, though I'm not denying that they lived according to their principles as far as opportunity was at hand. Number 2, but they were children of the Renaissance, if not of the Reformation, and there is some question whether there could have been a Reformation without a Renaissance. The Renaissance, which began in earnest in the 14th century in Italy, only gradually spread northward. But it fundamentally means rebirth, and it refers to the rebirth not of religion, but the rebirth of culture, particularly the ancient classical culture of the Greeks and Romans, which had been largely obliterated. In other words, it's a movement of the mind for the most part, but we've already observed that there isn't any such thing as true religion which doesn't begin in the mind. It must move to the heart, but you can't detour around the mind. There is no such thing as communicating with the heart except by ideas. And so even if the Renaissance, especially in its beginnings, was primarily an exercise in mind and thought and culture and so on, manifestly that is going to affect the heart. And when the Renaissance itself expanded northward into Britain and to Germany and so on, there it didn't deal so much with classical culture as with biblical culture, the study of the original language and the application of scientific exegesis to the Bible. And now these ideas, which are still academic and mental, are nevertheless basically religious and Christian ideas. You can see how the Renaissance of the mind, cultural in the first place, religious in the second place, could very well be a forerunner of a Reformation in the Church of Jesus Christ. Number 3, Renaissance meant rebirth, referring to Greek and Latin culture, which had been largely lost by the barbarian invasions of Europe. We all know these people were barbarians, and of course you have to remember that though we use the word loosely today of people who would be very learned but have very objectionable ideas and so on, these barbarians were real barbarians. That is, they were illiterate, they were masterful users of the sword, and they knew how to ride the Russian steppes and things like that, but they didn't have any culture worth mentioning, and they were the enemies to it, and they rode high over it because they thought with all the civilization of the Western world they couldn't stand against their primitive attacks. And barbarians are opposed to culture, and culture did suffer under them until they were civilized, largely, as I mentioned before, by the church. And now, civilized by the church, they're being affected by the Renaissance and classical culture of ancient Greek and Rome. Let me remind you once again what classical culture actually meant. I think it was either Alfred North Whitehead or Bertrand Russell. I think it was Whitehead who once said, all of Western philosophy is just a footnote to Plato. There's certainly no question that the influence as philosophers of Plato and Aristotle is greater than all of subsequent philosophy as far as its influence. It's still widely studied today. It's still a philosophy you either have to adopt or have to give some good reason for not adopting. So a return to classical culture was a step upward even for what would have been considered civilized Europe, not to mention the barbarians as well. If there's to be a rebirth from above, there must first be a rebirth from below. I remember our Lord's conversation with Nicodemus, for example. You remember how Nicodemus is confounded by Christ's teaching about the new birth. And Christ, at the beginning of the dialogue with Nicodemus, tells him how he must be born of God, and he must be born from above, and all that utterly stupefies Nicodemus. How can these things be? He expostulates. You remember Christ's statement? If you don't understand earthly things, how will you understand if I tell you heavenly things? Now see, the need for the new birth, the need for a new birth from above, is considered by Jesus Christ an earthly thing. And when Nicodemus stumbles, he's stumbling at earthly things. Now, what's that mean? Well, it means that when a Christian is communicating with a non-Christian, he's speaking, first of all, on an earthly level. He's trying to show him in terms of earthly categories. That, of course, if flesh is flesh and spirit is spirit, you must be born again. And if a person can't grasp even that, Christ has to ask him, what, you can't even grasp earthly things? How will you grasp a statement that I came down from above and that salvation is by the shedding of my blood, and so on? But see, when you hear that dialogue between Christ and Nicodemus on the new birth, you don't usually think of the Renaissance and the Reformation. But you can, in a certain sense, say Christ is talking with Nicodemus on a Renaissance level of common intelligence and a proper use of your mind to see verities which would lead you to religious truth before he begins to reveal to him religious truth. And in a certain sense, this is the pattern which is following. In a certain sense, Luther is a child of the Renaissance before he ever becomes a reformer. And I'm asking the question here whether there could have been a Reformation without a Renaissance, whether there could have been a reaching of the heart without this reaching of the mind that the Renaissance actually brought along. Number 4, God uses natural or common grace as well as supernatural or special grace for the well-being of his church. We are always rather tempted to look askance at education. I'll always remember that statement of one of the Joneses, one of the Bob Joneses, I don't know whether it's senior or grandson or who, but one of them once said, I'd rather have a person say, I seen something. If he really saw something, than have him say, I have seen something, when he never saw anything at all. Well, you have to admit that's the truth. We'd rather have a person violate the king's English if he gets the king's gospel than have him observe the king's English when he knows nothing of the king's gospel. But ideally, of course, we should say, I have seen Jesus Christ. That is, we should observe the King's English as well as the King's Gospel. We should appreciate common grace as well as special grace. We should appreciate the culture of the Renaissance as well as the salvation of the gospel. These shouldn't be posited as conflicting interests. When we talked about Tertullian, I didn't have time to mention what I think I'll inject at this particular point. When he contrasted Athens and Jerusalem. What he meant by that, this is where you learn nonsense, where you learn things that don't really benefit you. Here is where you must come. Avoid Athens. Go to Jerusalem. Now, that may be a little unfair interpretation of Tertullian because he certainly was an Athenian in some way, an extremely bright person. He knew how to use the Latin language and was an expert lawyer and so on. But nevertheless, there was a little bit of that strain between Renaissance and Reformation, between common grace and special grace. What I'm observing here is we should be able to go from Athens to Jerusalem. Now, it's perfectly true if we stop at Athens, it'll be fatal. Nobody's saved by going to Athens. He's only saved if via Athens he picks up a way of understanding what enables him to embrace the gospel of Jerusalem. But common grace and saving grace are not conflicting, manifestly, if they're forms of grace from the same God. They are not going to be conflicting. They're going to be synchronous. And while it's perfectly true that common grace is so called because it's common, everybody has it. And most of those who have it never actually receive saving grace at the same time. Nobody ever receives saving grace without first of all being born and the beneficiary of common grace. And I say to all of you, for example, whether you're converted people or not, if you're just listening to this as a course in church history or learning more about the gospel of Jesus Christ, if you learn more about church history and never come to the church of Christ, then of course your common grace is going to rise up in judgment against you, and the more you know about him without believing in him, the more unfortunate it's going to be for you. But not because common grace isn't gracious, but because you have made common grace into a common curse by not following it and using it and thanking God for it. Number 5, let me explain. When man fell, he lost the moral image of God, holiness, but not the natural image of God, reason and will. This is a theological foundation of what we're observing historically now in the Renaissance and in the Reformation and what we are saying about it. The image of God consists in what we call natural faculties and moral faculty. When man sinned, he died. Now, you know he didn't die as a person. He remained a human being. He still had a mind, he still had a conscience, he still had a power of choice. But his love for God was gone. His inclination to do God's will was replaced by hostility to God. This was totally obliterated. But this, not at all. And this is where our point of contact, as it were, with sinners exists. We talk to them as possessed of natural faculties which may be far greater than our own, so that they can understand that they are sinners and that they need grace and that they ought to believe in Jesus Christ. And that's the basis by which we can speak to them. Now, they will never find Christ attractive, though we could persuade them he ought to be attractive to them. They'll never find him attractive until their moral faculty is restored, until by regeneration what was lost by the fall comes to them again. But first of all, they have got to hear about Jesus Christ before Christ can even be meaningful, not to mention attractive to them. So please remember this historical phenomenon of the Renaissance and its precedents. The Reformation is manifestation of a sound theological principle, and particularly that we ought to appreciate common grace rather than act as if it were a common curse, which it becomes only when it is violated by mankind. Number 6, natural man can and often does cultivate the things of the mind and will, however sinfully motivated. Knowledge puffs up, but it's useful as seen in art, music, literature, and culture in general. The Renaissance mind can gain the whole world while losing its soul, but for those whose souls are alive, its culture can be a very great blessing, as you can see, I think, without any further elaboration by me. But I'm just reminding you all that the gospel is not opposed to learning and culture, good music, good literature, and such things as that. And if they can be produced by unregenerate people, because though unregenerate, they are not without their faculties for the cultivation of that. And generally speaking, God gives an abundance of common grace to those to whom he does not give special grace. And to those to whom he gives special grace, he doesn't as commonly give a great deal of extraordinary common grace. That is, your greatest philosophers, for example, your greatest artists, your greatest musicians, your greatest scholars in general, for the most part, are not evangelical Christians. Not many wise are called. It's just God's pleasure to give his saving mercy to those to whom he gives very little as far as common grace is concerned. But whatever we have, we appreciate, and whatever other people have, in far greater measure than we may have, we thank God for, if we are biblically minded. Number 7. So it was said that Nicholas of Lyra played the lyre to which Luther danced. Being interpreted, this means that Nicholas's great scholarship, producing many learned biblical commentaries, showed Luther how to use scholarship in his profound evangelical penetration of the Word of God. No evidence that Lyra himself was a reformer, but that he laid a foundation on which the reformer could build. Again, 8, Lorenzo Valla, closer to Luther's time, by his cultural researches on the forged donation of Constantine, we mentioned, remember, and on Scripture itself, showed Luther the way of necessary biblical scholarly exegesis or exposition from the original languages. There too, you see, the methodology that Luther was learning from a man like Valla, who is no reformer himself, nevertheless very beneficial, if not downright indispensable, to the Reformation. Number 9, saying Erasmus, whose life overlapped Luther's, laid the egg Luther hatched, a very common statement, seems especially strange, inasmuch as Erasmus's and Luther's theology were polemically opposed. Yet it was Erasmus's biblical scholarship and his ridicule of monasticism and so on that made Luther possible. As I say, I could never, every time I mention this, I feel downright stupid, but it's such a common statement that I'm at least among a company of fools, and not all by myself at any rate, in this oft-stated remark that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. Luther got off that egg in a hurry when he realized that Erasmus's egg. He was a real reformer, and as soon as Erasmus realized what Luther was up to, he distanced himself from him. But the saying is fundamentally true. Erasmus was the outstanding scholar of his time, and as such influential across the board. And while his theology was abominable in the sight of Luther, who condemned it roundly in his own volume, The Bondage of the Will, nevertheless, Erasmus's edition of the New Testament, his general learning, his sharp wit, and so on, was held at a premium by Martin Luther. Finally, number 10, probably the greatest non-reformational forerunner of Luther's Reformation was William of Akhom, an English Franciscan monk whose unsound philosophical and theological principles indirectly led Martin Luther in the true path. I'll read that again because you probably don't believe your own eyes. This is such an incoherent kind of sentence, and yet I stake my reputation on its accuracy. Probably the greatest non-reformational forerunner of Luther's Reformation was William of Akhom, an English Franciscan monk whose unsound philosophical and theological principles indirectly led Martin Luther in the true path. Let me explain. First of all, Akhom was Franciscan. And Franciscans were virtually the Methodists of the Roman communion. You know, they have their orders, and those orders all have various kinds of emphases. And the closest to the Reformed view was the Augustinian order, of which Luther himself became a member. Next to that, the Dominican. You might say these were the Presbyterians of the Roman Catholic fold. They're all under the Roman authority, so they're all Roman, you understand. But insofar as they have their own emphases, this was the Presbyterian, shall we say, the Calvinist. Here, the Dominicans were the Lutherans of the Roman Church. The Franciscans were the Methodists, the Arminians of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the interesting thing about Akhom is that he belonged to this, the farthest removed from the Reformation kind of theology. Luther was in the Augustinian order, and Lutheranism declined somewhat from Luther, but Luther himself was a thoroughgoing Calvinist, as we would say in contemporary language. But here is a man who, even in the Roman doctrine, is farthest removed from him, that nevertheless influences Luther so much. Another thing about him, which is, I think, repugnant to sound thought, but yet had beneficial influence on Luther, was the fact that he was a nominalist in philosophy. That is, he denied that there were any such thing as universal ideas, that Aquinas, for example, challenged in somewhat the Platonic way and so on. No, there are just particulars, and you can't make universal statements. A very unsound pattern of thought, in my opinion, but the reason it had a beneficial effect on Luther, I conjecture. I can't prove this. I don't know that anybody's tried to prove or disprove this particular point, but the reason this kind of philosophy had a liberating influence on Luther was, I think, because it was contrary to the prevailing philosophy. The Thomistic philosophy had been accepted since the 13th century, and Thomas Aquinas, the dominant theologian, and since that time he has been declared father number one of the Roman Catholic Church. And certainly this theological system I've described before that held Luther in chains was grounded on this type of thought, just as this matter of transubstantiation was. You had to have an idea of breadness to have such a concept as transubstantiation. It's sort of underlaid on. Now, Luther, when he came on the scene, was in the toils of this soteriological, salvific scheme that I have described before, and it was wrapped up with this kind of thought. The very fact that William of Akhom opposed that sort of liberated Luther from the system. I don't think this was a sound basis, you understand. Here again, history gets complicated. This scheme of salvation that we have described, which was really pernicious and seen as such by Luther was nevertheless wrapped up with an essentially sound philosophy. And Luther had to have that sound philosophy attacked by an unsound philosophy to be liberated from an unsound theological system, is my explanation of why this kind of philosophy would have a liberating influence on him. Another thing in the thinking of William of Akhom that influenced Luther was another scandalous thing, the Nutzlehre, the necessary lie. Akhom took that position that there were times in which it was justifiable to tell a lie. And Luther went along with him, and when one of the great political leaders of the Reformation, Prince Philip of Hesse, was entering into a bigamous relationship because he was unable to resist his adulterous ways, Luther was partner to this. He was very unhappy with Philip, but it was perfectly obvious that Philip couldn't behave sexually with his wife, and Luther was partner to his secretly marrying this woman he desired, with the understanding that Philip would never make this public, and that Luther would deny any part in it if he did, under the heading of the Nutzlehre, the necessary lie. Luther was wrong, I believe, but the idea came from him. Another way, and this we'll see in later lectures, becomes very, very important. William of Akhom was opposed to transubstantiation, but he at the same time held to the consubstantiation idea. Now this too enabled Luther to break more easily with the Roman dogma of transubstantiation, which was a good thing, but this idea that Christ's body was present in, of, and under the sacrament, not changed into, was something that Luther could live with, and at the same time apart from Rome on it. There was one other thing I don't even have time to do much more than mention, and that is because of his kind of philosophy, William of Akhom really could claim that the church's system was basically wrong. It wouldn't cohere as a consistent package and so on, but at the same time, William of Akhom could be an obedient child of the church generally. He didn't think that the church, that there was such a thing as a sound philosophy, and the fact that the church was wrong and a good many of those things didn't inhibit him in the slightest from receiving the church's package and remain in the church there. And that's the reason he was read by Luther and with him. And ultimately, when Luther called him mein liebster Meister, my beloved master, you realize how profoundly influential this man was, in spite of the fact that he represents a great many errors. He was a noble man in many ways. He fought for some very grand principles and didn't hesitate to oppose the church where he felt she was in error, and in that sense of the word, bequeathed naturally a kind of reforming tradition to Martin Luther.